Belgrade, capital of Serbia. As you walk around the city's bustling streets, you'll be mesmerized by its eccentric architecture, lively markets, busy restaurants, and historic churches. The people here are proud, living in a city whose history goes back over 7,000 years. But as you explore further, you will notice something different under the surface. Amidst the atmosphere of modernity, vestiges of a once great state remain, whether it be symbols, monuments, or flags, traces of a country that holds a special place in people's hearts. To the west, we see a different story. Here, the remnants of this same state are present, but not remembered so fondly. Vandalized memorials of Serbian generals give us painful reminders of the past. Murals depict the horrors of war, reminding locals of the atrocities that scarred the city just 3 decades ago. Yet, in contrast, other paintings honor the same generals, and graffiti calls for violence against inhabitants of this very neighborhood. Seeing all this, it may seem impossible to believe that these two places were ever part of a single united entity, but, remarkably, they were. Not so long ago, Yugoslavia existed in the Western Balkans, a bold experiment in regional unity, bringing together its multiple ethnic groups, languages, and religions, notably Slovenes, Croats, Bosniaks, Serbs, Albanians, Montenegrins, and Macedonians. Forged from the ashes of the Great War, Yugoslavia became an economic powerhouse, respected on the global stage, until it collapsed into oblivion. So what happened to this beautiful country? How did Yugoslavia rise, and why did it ultimately fall? In this video, we shall cover Yugoslavia's entire history, from its creation in 1919 to its disintegration throughout the 1990s. If you're only interested in a certain period, there are timestamps below. Without further ado, here is the rise and fall of Yugoslavia. For centuries, the Western Balkans were occupied by the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. The inhabitants of these lands were diverse, and although some tolerated and even supported their overlords, many of them desired independence, which Serbia and Montenegro accomplished in 1878. Throughout the early 20th century, the Ottomans were kicked out of the region, allowing for Serbia's territory and nationalism to grow. Nationalist groups formed, seeking the expulsion of the Austrians and the expansion of Serbia to protect the region's Slavic peoples. One of these nationalist groups, the Black Hand, Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, causing the empire to retaliate and ignite the First World War. During the war, Serbia and its ally Montenegro resisted fiercely, but were ultimately defeated by the Central Powers in 1915, its armies retreating south towards Greece. During this period of exile and occupation, Serbian leaders in Corfu met with members of the Yugoslav Committee, composed of Croats and Slovenes. Both groups hoped that victory would allow for locals to unite into a common state, but they did not agree on how to do so. The Serbs, led by Nikola Pasic, believed in a centralized state dominated by Serbia, while the committee, led by Anten Trumbic, wanted a federalized country with equal partnerships between all ethnicities. In 1917, the Corfu Declaration was signed, which stated that the new state would be a constitutional monarchy under the Serbian Karađorđević dynasty, whose constitution would be drafted by a future assembly. The new government would respect equality of religion, alphabets, and voting rights, while the matter of centralization was specifically omitted because of disagreements between both sides. The committee had signed because it was in a difficult situation. They believed in a unified state and preferred one without a Serbian king, but they were well aware that the Entente had promised Italy Dalmatian territory and did not want a repeat of the Ottoman and Austrian occupations. In November 1918, as Austria-Hungary fell apart, representatives of the Serbian government went to Geneva for more negotiations. They met with the Yugoslav Committee in the newly proclaimed National Council of the states of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, which controlled the northwestern Balkans. Anarchy had broken out in the former Habsburg lands, and everyone knew Serbia's military and police force were the only ones with the resources to stabilize the region and protect it from foreign meddling. Left with no choice, the National Council soon sent a delegation to the Serbian Prince Regent Alexander, asking him to proclaim the unification of the South Slavs into a new state, based on the Corfu Declaration. On December 1st, 1918, Alexander accepted, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, also known as the First Yugoslavia, was born. It would be recognized by the rest of the world in the 1919 Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Although the Western Balkans had accomplished the impossible, this was only the beginning. Creating a cohesive governmental system which united the country's various ethnicities was one of the many challenges that lay ahead. In 1919, the new Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes had one major objective: write a constitution approved by the National Assembly. Centuries of foreign rule had left each ethnicity focused on themselves, which was reflected in Yugoslav politics. The state's main parties were the Serbian Radical Party and Democratic Party, as well as the Communist Party, Croatian People's Peasant Party, and Yugoslav Muslim Organization. The Radical Party, which sought Serbian domination, proposed a constitution increasing King Alexander's power, granting him oversight in legislative and executive affairs, also weakening the parliament. Once presented to the assembly, the constitution was only supported by the Serbian parties and their 183 votes, 27 short of approval. To secure support, the Serbs appealed to the Muslims of Bosnia and Herzegovina, descendants of those converted by the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s. Muslims were granted special privileges by the Sultan and thus owned most of the land in the region. When anarchy broke out at the end of World War I, many non-Muslims took advantage of the situation to overthrow their landlords. Thus, the Serbs in parliament appealed to these Muslim landowners, offering compromises like the preservation of their nation, religious protections, and financial compensation for the land they lost. The constitution passed thanks to the Serbian Muslim coalition, while the communists and Croats boycotted the vote. Although enacted legally, the constitution was resented by non-Serb and non-Muslim parties, feeling illegitimate. Following the Vidovdan constitution, the country struggled with economic woes, food shortages, and crime. Political tensions worsened with the banning of the Communist Party, adoption of the Serbian dinar, and rise of paramilitaries. Non-Serbs felt like the system was rigged against them. In parliament, the Serbian Radical Party clashed with the Croatian Peasant Party, which sought Croat autonomy or even becoming independent. Tensions reached a breaking point when one day, during a session, the Radical Party's Puniša Račić drew a handgun and shot 3 members of the Peasant Party amidst an argument, including its leader Stjepan Radić. The political chaos left King Alexander with 2 options: allow Croatian independence in the end of the country, or abolish the Vidovdan constitution, ban all political parties, and declare a dictatorship. He chose the latter. Alexander's dictatorship blamed the chaos on nationalism, working to erase local identity. He redrew provincial borders into Banovinas based on location rather than ethnicity and renamed the country to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. He suppressed all dissent and displays of national identity, creating a new constitution and elections in 1931 which maintained his immense power, giving only the illusion of democracy. Meanwhile, fascism was on the rise, most notably the Croatian Ustaše, meaning insurgent. Led by Ante Pavelić, the Ustaše began operating from fascist Italy after the royal dictatorship, funded by Mussolini. They obsessed over Croatia's supposed glorious past and envisioned a state that was adopting views similar to Jews, Romani, and Orthodox Serbs. They believed if they caused enough chaos in Yugoslavia, they could declare independence. At first, they started insurgencies and launched a coup, but these failed without any popular support, causing them to switch strategies. In 1934, as King Alexander visited France, he was suddenly shot by an Ustaše-linked gunman, dying on the spot. Yugoslavia was left in a regency led by Alexander's cousin, Prince Paul, since his son Peter was only 11 years old, too young to rule. Throughout the 1930s, Yugoslavia's economy struggled from the Great Depression, relying heavily on trade with Germany, who needed the region's raw materials. Political polarization continued, which Prime Minister Dragiša Cvetković attempted to solve through the Sporazum, creating a new province, the Banovina of Croatia. This gave more autonomy to Croats in matters of police, education, justice, and administration. However, this just opened the door for other nationalities such as Serbs and Bosnian Muslims to make similar demands. All these issues came to a halt with the start of World War II in 1939. Yugoslavia immediately declared its neutrality, but by 1940 they had no choice. Italy had invaded Greece, and Germany needed access through the country, pressuring Yugoslavia to join the Tripartite Pact. Prince Paul, knowing the alternative was invasion, accepted on the condition he didn't have to fight in the war. As soon as Paul accepted, mass demonstrations broke out all over the country, preferring war over joining Germany. Military officers overthrew the Prince Regent and installed 17-year-old Peter as king, trying to leave the pact. Seeing Yugoslavia as untrustworthy, invaded soon after. By 1941, the first Yugoslavia officially came to an end, with Peter's government escaping to Britain and operating as a government in exile. In the 2 decades following its creation, Yugoslavia was unable to unite, in fact worsening things with a totalitarian dictatorship. The inability of the Yugoslav system to address the concerns of all ethnic groups would be put on full display for the next 4 years, as extreme inter-ethnic violence exploded, resulting in the deaths of over 1 million people. In 1941, Germany and its allies formally reorganized the territory of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Slovenia was annexed by Germany, while Vojvodina, Macedonia, and Montenegro were divided between Hungary, Bulgaria, and Italy, who sought to erase local cultures and impose their own. Serbia became a puppet state, while the independent state of Croatia was created, led by the Ustaše under Ante Pavelić, also a German puppet. The Ustaše immediately carried out its ultra-nationalist agenda, suppressing all dissent. Serbs were also targets of violence, but the Ustaše saw the potential for some of them, particularly peasants, to be assimilated as Croats and thus eliminated anything that could spread Serbian culture. Serbs were removed from public office, while the Orthodox religion and the Cyrillic alphabet were banned. Highly educated Serbs were also and forcefully converted to Croatian Catholicism in hopes they would leave. When this didn't work, the Ustaše turned to the Some Bosnian Muslims also joined the Ustaše, as the group considered Muslims to be Croats of a different religion and because they shared a strained history with Serbs. Opposition quickly grew. Former Serb army generals formed the Chetniks, who, like the Ustaša, envisioned a greater state, though Serbian rather than Croatian. A group known as the Partisans were also created, composed of former members of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which had been operating underground ever since its ban by the monarchy. Led by Josip Tito, they sought to re-establish Yugoslavia under communist rule, where every nationality would be equal. Initially, Chetniks and Partisans worked together against the Ustaša, but with time they came to disagree on many issues, notably the treatment of non-Serb civilians. The Chetniks wanted to them, while the Partisans wanted to recruit them, as they wanted all nationalities in the socialist revolution. By late 1941, the two sides were fighting each other, all while resisting the Ustaša. In Bosnia and Croatia, the Ustaša continued their campaign against Serbs, Jews, and Romani, while the Chetniks Muslims and Croats. The Partisans instead fought with a lighter touch, trying to recruit defeated enemies to their side. However, many disobeyed orders, and likely because of personal reasons. Large efforts were conducted by the Partisan leadership to stop their men from needlessly killing. As the war dragged on, the Partisans garnered more support and gained ground in northwestern Bosnia. The Chetniks, desperate, began collaborating with the German army, while the Ustaša, under pressure from their overlords, relaxed their attacks on Serbs, prioritizing conversion over creating the Croatian Orthodox Church. This new dynamic pushed many Serbs to leave the Chetniks and join the Partisans. In November 1942, Tito and the Communists organized the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, laying out their goals for the future. Initially, the council did not outright aim to remove King Peter, since the Yugoslav government in exile, the remnants of the monarchy, was still internationally recognized. Instead, they emphasized the desire to unite the multi-ethnic resistance of the Partisans, wanting to get the support of the country's inhabitants. The Yugoslav government in exile, based in London, was split among ethnic lines, but generally supported the Chetniks, seeing them as the force which could restore the monarchy. They also feared the communist nature of the Partisans and ignored the fact that the Chetniks were collaborating with the Germans. For the rest of the war, the Partisans and the government in exile would continue to operate in this rivalry, having different plans for a free Yugoslavia but also seeking the expulsion of the Axis occupation. In 1943, the Allies invaded Italy and started sending weapons to the Partisans, concluding that they were the most effective resistance group. This allowed the Partisans to secure parts of Dalmatia, all while King Peter, under pressure from the Allies, encouraged all Yugoslavs to support Tito, further increasing their legitimacy and popular support. In a second and third session of the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, the Communists laid the foundation for a federation with national equality and denied the legitimacy of King Peter, saying he could only return if the people chose him. By 1945, the Partisans controlled most of Yugoslavia, while the remaining Chetniks and Ustaša retreated northwest, many of whom would later escape to the Americas. To secure control and eliminate opposition, the Partisans conducted mass leftover resistance and political opponents, all without fair trials. By the end of the war, around 1 million people had the region, including 500,000 Serbs and 80% of the Yugoslav Jewish population. The Yugoslav people had gone through hell, experiencing unprecedented violence from enemies both inside and outside the country, each with their own interpretation of nationality. Tito and the Communists had an immense challenge up ahead, uniting all of Yugoslavia's diverse peoples under a new system, a task which the previous government had been unable to accomplish. In 1945, Yugoslavia's new communist regime under Josip Tito solidified its control. The National Assembly was created, similar to the monarchist one, which had all of its 354 seats secured by the Communist Party in the November election, as opposition parties were banned or heavily restricted. The assembly was essentially the party's depiction of a united front, generally just approving its decisions, also trying to make it look like they were chosen by the people. Although it's true that they had immense popular support, it was not unanimous. As Marxist-Leninists, the party believed that their victory in the Second World War was a socialist one, in which the working class had risen up and defeated the Axis powers and their collaborators. To convey this message, the government highlighted the war and the sacrifices made to create communist Yugoslavia, focusing on the dead like fallen fighters or soldiers and victims of fascism or civilians. Non-communists were also excluded. This policy offered social services like housing or scholarships to families of the dead, and unified the state behind a common story, with alternative interpretations being strictly suppressed. They also promoted brotherhood and unity, portraying the Yugoslav people as family and equal to one another. This acknowledged the country's multi-ethnicity while also promoting unity, trying to avoid future inter-ethnic violence. These principles were emphasized by the government through education, propaganda, and public monuments, becoming cornerstones of the Yugoslav state. In 1946, the new Yugoslavia drafted a constitution, approved by the National Assembly, creating a federation with republics based on ethnic homelands like Croatia and Serbia. Bosnia and Herzegovina was recognized as a unified republic of Serbs, Croats, and others, excluding Muslims, considered a religious group rather than an ethnic one. Republics also granted equal rights to minorities, who were sovereign members of their state. For example, a Serb living in Croatia was inherently connected to the Socialist Republic of Serbia. Autonomous zones were also created inside Serbia, giving autonomy to the various minorities of Vojvodina, notably Hungarians and the large Albanian ethnic population in Kosovo. The constitution emphasized equality among all republics, nations, and ethnic groups, specifying that everyone's contributions during the war were equal, even if this was inaccurate. By 1947, the communists banned all non-communist parties and put major leaders of the Chetniks and Ustaše on trial. They also created the State Security Service, a secret police force whose first task was to hunt down remaining resistance from the Axis collaborators in the mountains or assassinate its members living abroad. The service became critical in suppressing political dissent. Yugoslavia was now fully under Tito and the Communist Party's grasp. They had successfully created a system of governance which acknowledged the country's multi-ethnicity and promoted equality between all, reminding everyone of the horrors of the Second World War. Despite being effective at first, the system was inherently flawed. Although promoting unity, it was heavily enforced through the communist system, with nationalism and dissent punished with imprisonment, exile, or death. If the party fell, fractured, or weakened, then Yugoslavia's united front would disappear and the consequences could be catastrophic. In 1947, Yugoslavia was at a crossroads for its future. Despite Josip Tito's previous successes, establishing himself as Yugoslavia's de facto head of state, the country faced other issues. Ever since its rebirth, it was seen as another part of the Eastern Bloc, closely linked with the USSR. The Yugoslav Communist Party, although completely independent from Moscow, even pursued similar policies like the collectivization of agriculture, abolishing private producers and incorporating them into collective farms, often by force. However, following the Soviet path would not last for long. Back in 1946, Tito's government had started supporting the communists in the Greek Civil War, but Soviet leader Joseph Stalin opposed such an intervention, wanting to avoid tensions with the West. Tito disagreed, unhappy that the USSR thought it could dictate Yugoslavia's foreign policy, and only stopped supporting the Greek communists after the US promised them economic credits. Stalin was unhappy. He wanted obedience from all communist states in Europe, while Tito wanted them to be equal. In 1948, Tito asserted Yugoslav independence, rejecting outside control, causing Stalin to rally the Cominform, an organization composed of all communist parties in the world. He accused Yugoslavia of being anti-communist and cut off all economic ties with the country, hoping the Soviet-aligned Cominformists in Yugoslavia would stage a coup. Tito reacted aggressively, ordering mass arrests of over 50,000 people, many of them innocent, putting them in prison camps. He also ordered a purge of the military, known as the Yugoslav People's Army, removing 4,000 to 7,000 officers and soldiers. No coup ever occurred, and Stalin began amassing troops in neighboring Soviet satellite states, but backed down after Tito appealed to the USA, which promised protection. Following the Tito-Stalin split, Yugoslavia shifted its policies, enacting its own brand of communism. The Communist Party believed that the Soviet Union had not accomplished Marx's goals and wanted to put power in the hands of the people. In 1953, Yugoslavia stopped collectivization, bringing back private farm ownership and allowed those who had their lands collectivized to return. The communists reinforced their founding ideology, stating that the Yugoslav people alone had liberated themselves during World War II, building thousands of monuments commemorating this idea. However, the monuments were often abstract, hiding the true nature of the events that occurred, omitting the fact that the violence was a result of inter-ethnic tensions. The government also started the process of decentralization, giving more power to workers in their jobs in Yugoslavia's individual republics, also renaming the Communist Party to the League of Communists, a clear distinction from the USSR. Throughout the 1960s, Yugoslavia flourished, fostering an economic relationship with the United States and the Soviet Union, whose new leader Nikita Khrushchev apologized for Stalin's actions. Because of this, Yugoslavia was able to maintain neutrality in the Cold War, founding the non-aligned movement along with Indonesia and Egypt, aimed at keeping the independence of countries outside the Eastern and Western blocs. However, the country did not remain without issue. The League of Communists began fracturing, mainly because of one core idea, decentralization. One faction wanted it to increase, notably Srn Milovan Djilas, while another desired re-centralization, arguing that the government needed to control aspects like the economy. Djilas was passionate about decentralization, and although he was supported by Tito, his criticisms of the party and Yugoslavia's state structures went too far, advocating for multi-party elections, arguing the League of Communists were like a new upper class. Because of this, he was ejected from the party and sent to prison. Despite the treatment of Djilas, what he said was correct. The League of Communists were a new class, with many corrupt members stealing state funds and accumulating wealth. This wasn't widely known to the public, but the party's disunity had become apparent, which wasn't helped by its disagreements regarding the General Investment Fund, a mechanism which spread wealth evenly among Yugoslavia's republics. Although it benefited the poorer regions like Macedonia and Montenegro, building factories and giving locals employment opportunities, it was resented by elites in the richest republics, Croatia and Slovenia, and even some members of the party. These disagreements put Yugoslavia in a difficult situation. Funding poorer regions helped avoid nationalism and dissent as the people were satisfied, but on the other hand, criticism from the party in the country's richest republics once again showed disunity. In 1962, the League of Communists held a series of meetings to discuss the country's future. Issues of localism were evident as each republic wanted to pursue their own interests, an issue which Tito addressed by continuing decentralization. He hoped that the increased autonomy would keep the republics happy and therefore avoid conflict with one another. Of course, this was flawed thinking. By increasing the autonomy of the republics, Tito was only enabling localism. A year later, Yugoslavia signed a new constitution, giving each republic the right to secede and repudiating any policy of homogenization, officially recognizing Muslims as an ethnic group. In the following few years, republics were granted the power to manage their own economies and the General Investment Fund was ended. These changes gave the republics the power to pursue their own agendas, all while maintaining Tito's popularity as the central figure behind Yugoslavia's reforms. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, conflicts between the republics continued to soar, despite the continued decentralization. Aleksandar Rankovic, a Serb and the head of Yugoslavia state security, was fired after being exposed for wiretapping Tito's phone, sparking outrage from Serbia, who felt they were being targeted. On the other hand, Croatia accused Serbia of being favorites, and Serbian banks controlled most of the country's large investments, despite Croatia generating the most revenue. Croats began disregarding the Serbo-Croatian language, declaring Croatian to be an entirely separate one, even though the two were similar and plans were previously made to further unite the languages. Tito, worried about conflict, offered concessions to the Croats, including the recognition of the Croatian language and increased autonomy, a temporary fix to the problem. A similar crisis occurred in Kosovo, where ethnic Albanians were unhappy at how Serbs occupied most positions of power and had greater access to education, despite Albanians being a majority. Once again, Tito offered concessions, like founding the Albanian-exclusive Pristina University. These crises, although ultimately dealt with, showed that nationalism could only really be suppressed by Tito himself. In 1974, Yugoslavia signed a third and final constitution, which further increased decentralization, bringing the country from a federation to a confederation, by definition an equal union of all, giving less power to the federal government and more to the republics. It emphasized equal representation, economic control, and created local defense forces for each republic, separate from the Yugoslav People's Army. The autonomous provinces of Vojvodina and Kosovo were also given increased autonomy, which only angered Serbia. Despite the internal party disagreements and ethnic tensions, Yugoslavia looked relatively prosperous. For 3 decades, it had achieved industrial growth, modernization, workers' rights, and offered a high quality of life with relative freedom, education, and healthcare, far better than other communist states in Europe. This was greatly helped by the 1973 first oil shock, where Gulf states increased the price of oil, growing the revenue and investing into large Western banks. In turn, these banks offered loans to developing economies like Yugoslavia's, which were used to improve the country, particularly its poorer regions, maintaining good living conditions but also accruing billions of dollars in debt. However, this backfired just a few years later. When the Gulf states raised the price of oil again, Western banks increased interest rates, making it so Yugoslavia couldn't repay its loans. To respond, the federal government took loans from the International Monetary Fund, which were given on the condition they would follow their advice, like reducing government spending and liberalizing the economy. But because of decentralization, the League of Communists couldn't implement such changes and asked the republics to follow the IMF's measures, who refused because it didn't benefit them. When the IMF saw this, they stopped their aid and asked for loans to be repaid, further exacerbating Yugoslavia's economic issues. What followed was a decade-long economic crisis, where unemployment grew, consumer goods decreased, and quality of life worsened. The 1979 economic crisis marked the end of Yugoslav prosperity and the start of its decline. Decentralization had left every republic fending for itself, and combined with poor economic conditions and political crises culminated in the rise of nationalism. If another crisis or tragedy were to occur, then the total collapse of Yugoslavia could very well be on the way. In 1980, Yugoslavia was in the middle of an economic crisis, which was only exacerbated by the process of decentralization, which had gradually weakened the federal government. Quality of life was on the decline, culminating in the continued rise of nationalism. Each republic was prioritizing themselves over Yugoslavia, while more extreme nationalist groups gained traction. Although the situation was tumultuous, the preservation of the norm and the Yugoslav system seemed likely, at least for the near future. However, everything changed on May 4, 1980. In the Croatian city of Split, a soccer game between HNK Hajduk Split and Red Star Belgrade was suddenly paused in the 41st minute. The crowd and the players listened in horror as the death of President Tito was announced. Players collapsed onto the field, heartbroken and unable to function. The idea of socialist Yugoslavia was truly unimaginable without its founder and only ever president. The League of Communists quickly tried to stabilize things. They created the President of the Presidency of Yugoslavia, a system which rotated leaders every year, but none were ever as popular as Tito. Yugoslavia's unifying figure was now gone, and without him, there was no central authority capable of bringing stability in times of crisis. It only took a year for the first major inter-ethnic tensions to break out. In Kosovo, ethnic Albanian students, workers, and miners protested against poor economic conditions and limited job opportunities. They accused the Serbian government of negligence and being biased towards Serbs as they still occupied most positions of power. The protesters demanded Kosovo be elevated to the status of a republic, or if necessary, secede from Yugoslavia. Communist authorities responded by deploying the Yugoslav People's Army and imposing martial law, violently crushing the protests. Hundreds were injured and 10,000 Serbs and Montenegrins left Kosovo. This event triggered nationalist sentiment in Serbia, demanding the abolition of the autonomous zone of Kosovo, fueled by a leaked document written by Serb intellectuals called the Memoranda, which claimed that Serbs were systematically oppressed throughout Yugoslavia. This reinforced the notion that Serbs were victims throughout their history and needed to protect themselves. Combined with the continued economic crisis and the Agro-Commerce affair, which exposed mass corruption in the League of Communists, public anger grew, setting the stage for one man to fan the flames: Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic was a Serb nationalist and the president of the League of Communists in Serbia, who gained popularity for his support of the Serbs in the Kosovo crisis, even when they instigated violence. He portrayed himself as the Serbs' hero, advocating for the re-centralization of Yugoslavia under Serb control, removing the autonomous zones of Kosovo and Vojvodina. Milosevic justified Serbian claims over Kosovo by invoking the 1389 medieval Battle of Kosovo, a key part of Serbian national identity. Serbian nationalists framed the battle as a struggle between Christianity and Islam, even if inaccurate. In his infamous Gazi Mestan speech in 1989, Milosevic used the battle to legitimize the link between Serbia and Kosovo. He further stoked nationalism by convincing his supporters that Serbia was once again under threat and that it could soon turn violent. Between 1987 and 1989, Milosevic orchestrated the anti-bureaucratic revolution, a series of mass rallies and political takeovers in which his supporters harassed politicians who disagreed with him. In Vojvodina and the neighboring Republic of Montenegro, those in power resigned from the pressure and were soon replaced by Milosevic loyalists. In Kosovo, top-ranked Albanian politicians were ousted, allowing the Serbian parliament to reduce Kosovan autonomy. At the same time, Serbian TV and newspapers became aggressively nationalist, portraying Serbs as victims, invigorating Serbs in Croatia who pushed for their own autonomous province. Serbia's government and many of its people were reshaping Yugoslavia's political atmosphere, prioritizing their own security against what they perceived as outside threats. Slovenia and Croatia's governments countered, advocating for greater autonomy, some even suggesting a looser confederation, pushing the 1974 constitution even further. This would remove any central army, government, or single-party system. If these individuals got their way, Yugoslavia would be a country in name only. By January 1990, the League of Communists was fracturing among ethnic lines, all while inflation rates skyrocketed and the conflict in Kosovo continued. The republics expressed concern towards Milosevic's actions, and Slovenian leaders hinted at secession. An extraordinary Congress of the League of Communists was also organized, where Milosevic hoped to force centralization onto the rest of the country. The Slovenian delegation instead opposed the motion and proposed a looser confederation. When their proposal was shut down by the Serbian and Montenegrin delegations, the Slovenians walked out, followed by the Croatians, effectively ending the League of Communists. The collapse of the Congress was essentially the political end of Yugoslavia. Each republic was now acting alone, with increased control over its budgets, policies, and defense forces, all while nationalist conflict escalated, notably among Serbs in Croatia. Yugoslavia's complete collapse was yet to come, and a lot of blood would be spilled to solidify it. In 1990, the collapse of the League of Communists left each republic fending for itself, organizing their first multi-party elections. Slovenia, Croatia, and Macedonia elected non-communist leaders, pushing for independence, while Bosnia's parliament split along ethnic lines, also seeing some support for leaving Yugoslavia. On the other hand, Serbia and Montenegro staunchly supported their local branches of the League of Communists. Although communist in name, these governments had become increasingly nationalist, allowing Slobodan Milosevic to continue his agenda. The Yugoslav People's Army, led by those who wanted to maintain Yugoslavia, began seizing weapons from Slovenia and Croatia, preparing for the worst. The People's Army, although officially representing Yugoslavia, gradually became a Serbian-dominated institution closely aligned with Milosevic. Determined to maintain Yugoslavia and expand Serbia's borders into a greater state, Milosevic threatened the leaders of other republics if they called for confederation. He also supported the Serbians living in other republics, preparing Serbia and the People's Army for war. In Croatia, Serbian minorities became concerned after the election of President Franjo Tuđman, a nationalist who wanted Croatian independence. Tuđman's rhetoric and promotion of the Croatian Savnica or checkerboard reminded the Serbs of the ultra-nationalist Ustaše, worried of the future in a potentially independent Croatia. In August 1990, Croatian Serbs held an illegal referendum calling for autonomy, passing with nearly 100% of the vote. Under support from Milosevic, they began sabotaging roads and blocking Croat authorities, who had been thoroughly disarmed by the People's Army. Throughout late 1990 and the start of 1991, violence increased, with nationalist Serbian militias engaging in intense conflicts with Croatian police and Croat civilians. Both sides had their fair share of extremists, which only ignited tensions. In June 1991, Slovenia declared independence, confident it wouldn't face many repercussions. Milosevic had put less pressure on them, knowing he could not start rebellion from the inside like in Croatia. Slovenia was very homogeneous. However, the Yugoslav People's Army felt differently and attacked Slovenia, starting the 10-day war. As the name suggests, the People's Army's efforts were quickly thwarted by the Slovenian Defense Forces, who had managed to retain about a third of the weapons seized a year earlier. Combined with pressure from the European community and Milosevic, the army halted its invasion. Milosevic knew that if he wanted to maintain Yugoslavia and centralize it under his authority, then his priorities lay in where Serb minorities lived, notably Bosnia and Croatia. Shortly after the 10-day war, the Socialist Republic of Macedonia quietly declared independence after a referendum, with 96% of voters in favor. This time, both Milosevic and the People's Army didn't act, letting Macedonia leave without any issue, in part due to US peacekeeping forces at the border. The Macedonians remained largely uninvolved in the subsequent Yugoslav conflicts, their main struggles being international recognition in a dispute with Greece over its name. A month later, Croatia also declared independence. This time, Serbia retaliated immediately. Without declaring war, Serbia launched coordinated attacks from the north and south using the People's Army and paramilitary groups, the most infamous being the Tigers, led by Arkan, a former mobster hired by the government. Croatian defense forces, mostly local militias, were rapidly overrun, lightly armed without proper organization. Initially, Serbian forces committed many, including Vukovar and Ovčara, but the Croats later retaliated with many of their own. By late 1991, 30% of Croatia was occupied by the Serbs, who proclaimed the Republic of Serbian Krajina. Although claiming to be a separate country, Krajina saw almost no international recognition. It also carried out organized aiming to expel the Croatian population in about a third of the country. Foreign governments did little, although many European states gave legitimacy to the defenders' cause by acknowledging Slovenia and Croatia's independence. The United Nations also deployed UNPRO-4, peacekeeping forces intended to mitigate civilian violence and organize ceasefire negotiations, one of which was agreed upon in early 1992. Meanwhile, to the south, Bosnia and Herzegovina hung in the balance. Like in Croatia, ethnic tensions had grown exponentially since the League of Communists collapsed. Serbian nationalists, led by Radovan Karadžić and backed by Milosevic, had gained prominence in politics, advocating for Serb autonomy in Bosnia. They feared Serbs would lose power in a Muslim or Bosniak majority state, and thought Serbs needed to remain in Yugoslavia or join a greater Serbian nation. Negotiations broke down in parliament, and a referendum over independence was held. Boycotted by the Serb Bosnians, independence was passed with 99.7% voting yes. The next day, the Bosnian War began. Invigorated by Karadžić, Serbian paramilitaries entered northeastern Bosnia, supported by the Yugoslav People's Army. In Muslim towns like Bihać, they went door to door, expelling or killing Bosniak civilians. They burned homes and destroyed mosques and libraries, wanting to erase all non-Serb culture. The action was brutal and incredibly one-sided. During the early part of the war, the Serbs were adequately armed, but the Bosniaks were not, and mostly victims. Local defense forces did exist, but they were no match for the invaders, who soon started the siege of Sarajevo. The international community responded with an arms embargo on all of Yugoslavia, disproportionately affecting Bosnia and Croatia, since the Serbs were already well armed. Although Bosnia and Croatia were admitted to the United Nations, the UN refused to use the term, as according to its laws, this required military intervention. Instead, the UN Security Council answered with more indirect actions, notably economic sanctions. By late 1992, Bosnian Serbs controlled most of the country, proclaiming Republika Srpska, a Serb republic within Bosnia. They acted without much outside support, as Milosevic had withdrawn the Yugoslav People's Army to try and garner international sympathy, with many of its soldiers deserting and joining local Serb militias. The Bosnians, under President Alija Izetbegović, also started organizing a proper army, halting or delaying the Serb advance. Additionally, Bosnian Croats became less enthused with keeping Bosnia alive and started aligning with Croatian President Franjo Tuđman, who, like Milosevic, had aspirations over Bosnia. Initially, Croats and Bosniaks had fought shoulder to shoulder to defend the country, but with time their trust broke down and both sides tried to separately negotiate with the Serbs. In January 1993, violence erupted between Bosniaks and Croats in central Bosnia, and would spread north over several months. In August, Croatian nationalists established the Croatian Republic of Herzeg Bosnia, similar to Republika Srpska, aiming to divide Bosnia into three ethnic republics. Back in Croatia, the war had resumed, with the Croats rejuvenated and ready to fight back. They had organized a general mobilization in late 1991, were supported by Western European fighters, and had seized weapons from the Yugoslav People's Army. They launched major offensives in the Zadar area and another northeast called Operation Medak Pocket, gaining ground but also showcasing their horrific wars against Serbian Croats to the world. Throughout the rest of 1993, the Serbian forces in Croatia fell back as the Croats gained more and more momentum. In Bosnia, UNPRO-4 peacekeeping officers arrived, mandating safe areas around major cities as the Bosnian Serbs and Croats continued their advances. Places like Srebrenica returned to normal life, confident that UN forces would protect them. However, the peacekeepers were poorly equipped, and safe area wasn't a term with a proper definition or protocol attached to it. No one knew if or how the UN would respond if one was attacked. By early 1994, the war saw a major shift. The Washington Agreement officially ended the war between the Bosniaks and Croats, creating the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This officially united the lands occupied by the Bosnian army and the Croatian Defense Council against their common enemy, the Serbs. Combined with NATO and Croatian support, the Bosnian army was able to hold their positions, all while Bosniak and Croat civilians fled to safe zones and peace talks progressed. By 1995, the Croatian army was in full swing, launching Operations Flash and Storm. They recaptured most of the occupied territories, all while the Serb population, both military and civilian, fled or were forcefully removed. Around 200,000 Croatian Serbs went to Serb-occupied Bosnia and Herzegovina, or what remained of Yugoslavia. However, in June 1995, tragedy struck. Under orders from Karadžić, Ratko Mladić, a former People's Army officer, approached the safe zone of Srebrenica and started shelling it with artillery, tanks, and rocket launchers, all while taking UN hostages, calling the UN's bluff. Despite an ultimatum, Mladić continued, and UN superior officers did not take his actions seriously, some even disregarding it as Muslim propaganda. On July 10th, Serb forces closed in on the city, while many local UN guards did nothing, unable or unwilling to act. When the Serbs entered Srebrenica, Dutch UN Profor officers tried to peacefully stop them, but were fired upon. They requested NATO airstrikes, but French General Bernard Janvier denied the request, opting for intimidation flights, believing Mladić didn't actually want to take the city. Over the next few days, the Serbs overran Srebrenica and over 8,000 Bosniaks, mostly men and boys. Thousands more fled. Just a month later, Serbs outside Sarajevo shelled the city, striking Markdale Market, 43 and injuring 73. Serb media tried to deny responsibility, but couldn't do so effectively, further isolating Serbia internationally. In late July, Croatia and Bosnia launched a joint offensive, securing large parts of central and western Bosnia. During Operation Mistral II, the joint forces secured over 2,500 square kilometers of territory. Following this and bombing of Sarajevo, NATO had intensified their involvement, launching airstrikes on Serbian troops, forcing them to retreat. By September 26th, peace talks had begun in New York. Croatia's independence was the first to be solidified. On November 12th, the Republic of Croatia and local Serbs signed the Erdut Agreement, preserving Croatia's borders without making concessions to the Serbs, in fact expelling thousands of them. Just a month later, in Paris, the Dayton Agreement was signed by Bosnia, Croatia, and Serb-led Yugoslavia, which spoke for all Serb secessionist movements. The agreement created the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, permitted the deployment of NATO peacekeepers, and reformed Republika Srpska as one of the two political entities in the new country, giving Serbs autonomy. The Croatian War of Independence and the Bosnian War were now over, with about 120,000 dead and over 2.5 million displaced. The Federal Republic of Yugoslavia lived on, now consisting of Serbia and Montenegro and the autonomous provinces of Vojvodina and Kosovo under its dictator Slobodan Milosevic. But both him and the country did not have long left. Following the Yugoslav Wars, what remained of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia struggled. Economic conditions were already poor before the wars, with the Yugoslav dinar experiencing major hyperinflation. Although the removal of international sanctions following the Dayton Agreement did help, what came next didn't. From 1996 to 1998, Albanian separatism continued to grow in Kosovo, with the Kosovo Liberation Army repeatedly attacking Serbian law enforcement. Slobodan Milosevic, now president of Yugoslavia following his two-term limit as president of Serbia, intensified crackdowns against Kosovo. In 1998, the Kosovo War officially began, with the KLA openly fighting the army sent by Milosevic. Despite initial victories against the poorly trained KLA armies, Yugoslavia still suffered as international sanctions were once again placed on the country, devastating its already weak economy. In 1999, NATO issued a peace proposal to Yugoslavia, and when this was refused, NATO notoriously bombed the country, causing Yugoslavia to withdraw the army and allow a UN mission in the region, giving Kosovo a high level of autonomy. In September 2000, Yugoslavia held an election, with one main opposition party, the Democratic Opposition of Serbia, challenging the incumbent Slobodan Milosevic. However, after results were counted, irregularities were found. The DOS claimed their candidate Vojislav Koštunica had received over 50% of the vote, defeating Milosevic without needing a second election round. However, the government-controlled electoral committee denied this, and various organizations cited corruption, even accusing them of burning electoral documents. Protesters from all over the country took to the streets of Belgrade, all while police did little to respond. Part of parliament was set on fire, all while the protests intensified, causing Milosevic to resign on October 5th. Koštunica became president and Milosevic was detained by Serbian police in 2001. For the next several years, economic and living conditions continued to decline, and the country was renamed Serbia and Montenegro. In 2003, the constitution was modified, allowing a republic to hold a referendum on independence in 3 years, which Montenegro did in 2006, passing with 55.5% of the vote. Montenegro declared independence, and Serbia followed soon after, officially marking the end of Yugoslavia and the later state of Serbia and Montenegro. Yugoslavia's legacy is a complex one. For some, particularly in Serbia, it represents a better past, a country born out of defeating fascism and uniting the region's peoples, whose collapse was a tragedy. For others, particularly in Croatia, it demonstrates abuses of power, whose breakup is proof that the region cannot ever be united. The reasons behind Yugoslavia's fall are still hotly debated. While some may argue that there is a single definitive answer to what caused it, reality is a bit more complex. The collapse was not inevitable, and most certainly not just because of Tito's death. The issues which broke up the country were present before he died, like poor economic conditions and nationalism, which were exacerbated by political chaos and Milosevic's actions. It would also be unwise to blame Yugoslavia's collapse solely on its multi-ethnic nature. When the country's economy and political situation were stable, ethnic tensions were minimal, only intensifying when other aspects of society began to deteriorate. Inter-ethnic violence was often a symptom of decline rather than its cause, as can be seen with the Axis invasion preceding the Yugoslav Civil War of the 1940s or the economic crisis before the Yugoslav Wars. The reality is that there's no single answer as to why the Yugoslav experiment ultimately failed. Rather, its collapse was the result of a multitude of factors. Today, the vestiges of Yugoslavia can still be seen across Europe, whether it be symbols and monuments that pay tribute to it, narratives that condemn its existence, or stories in criminal trials calling back to the Yugoslav wars. Yugoslavia may no longer exist, but its impact is still prevalent in the lives, memories, and identities of millions. Analyzing Yugoslav history is not just important for understanding the past, but also for facing the challenges and complexities of the present. Thanks for watching. If you want to support the channel, liking and subscribing helps a lot and is greatly appreciated. You can also further aid the channel by making a one-time donation or becoming a monthly member below, but please, only do so if you can. My videos are free for a reason. Let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below, as well as anything else you find relevant. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and stories.